Okay. All right. So, Andrew Taylor Call. This has been a labor of love for Andrew for 17 years, and I'm really excited. The book was published last May, and I had the opportunity to go to Springfield, and he gave a presentation on his book even before it was published. But I'd like to read a few words about Andrew. Andrew is an attorney and historian. And Andrew's maternal ancestors included the founders of Chicago and were the founders of Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Ohio. Andrew is a board member, was a board member of the Hyde Park Historical Society. He is going to be coming back soon, and is a member. He's still a member of our organization. Since 2006, Andrew has been a member of more than 100 civic and professional organizations in Chicago and Cook County. These organizations include civic boards of directors, advisory boards, committees, and auxiliary boards, in addition to the many general memberships in various organizations. Andrew is deeply committed to the civic life of the Midwest. Also, Andrew's mother is a member of our organization. She lives in Florida. She lives in Virginia, and she can't be with us today, but she really helped us in terms of providing refreshments. Several years ago, Andrew's mother gave me a new title. She refers to me as Andrew's Chicago Mom. So I bug him just like his mother would. But it's really my really deep honor and pleasure to introduce you to Andrew Taylor Call.
Thank you all so much, Janice. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. It's a great honor for me to be here today. I'm going to be standing kind of over here. Cleveland, can you see me okay?
I'll get you, just keep going.
Okay. I'm right-handed, but I kind of wanted to have both sides of the room within view. So it's a great honor for me, and it's beyond what I can actually put into words, that what this means to have you all here today. And so many of you have seen me go through the last few years of this research project and the publication of it. This book began as private research, personal family history research, and sprouted very much from a personal interest in the United States Midwest, the Great Lakes, the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys, where my own people, both my mother and father's ancestors, come from for the past 250 years. And what began as a private research endeavor as a history major at the University of Virginia, where I was an undergraduate, it picked up a lot of momentum. And about 3 years ago, my mother finally told me, Andy, you can't let this just be personal history anymore. It's reached a point where you have to share this with the city of Chicago and with the Midwest. And I said, Mom, you're absolutely right. So I did not have in mind 17 and a half years ago that I would be producing a book like this. It would have appealed to me as a concept, but practically speaking, it would have seemed very far out of reach. About 2.5 years ago, almost 3 years ago, Fran Vandervoort here, one of our board members and a previous editor of the Hyde Park Historical Society newsletter, invited me to submit an article to our newsletter here about the Hyde Park Township part of our family. We have a lot of groups in Hyde Park, Woodlawn, Kenwood, and other communities in Hyde Park Township. And after a few months of writing and review, I was published in the fall 2016 Hyde Park Historical Society newsletter. And I cannot emphasize enough the fact that while I had all those years of research completed and information largely gathered, one of the most difficult things is how do you turn the key to actually start the writing process? Well, Fran Vandervoort and Janice and everyone here, Michael, Kathy, you all, and Ruth, you all gave me a chance to turn the key. And the article that I wrote for this Historical Society's newsletter, Faded Bricks, Old Family Tales from the South Side of Chicago, became the springboard into the book. The information was about 85% complete in terms of the research. During the writing process, I gathered quite a bit more, so the research ended up paralleling the writing process up until the last week of editing. It's an organic process. Yes. But my article for the Hyde Park Historical Society was the catalyst for the writing process. And that taught me a very important lesson. An article must never be underrated, not only as an instrument of academic dispersion of information and sharing, but also as a way to turn the key to turn something into a much, much, much bigger publication. So anyone here who has any ideas about writing processes, or has any ideas for things that are to become articles? Yes, Fran.
Could I make a statement or two about this fine person who approached us about writing an article about something that all of us are interested in? And when he first gave me a manuscript, I was almost overwhelmed with the detail and the information he provided. And it was fun working with you, Andrew, to produce, I think, a fairly good article. And it's online, by the way. You can get it, what month?
That was the fall of 2016.
2016. So if you go to the Hyde Park Historical Society website, go to publications, and you'll be able to find that article if you don't already have a copy of it. It's a very fine article. And now we have the fine book.
Thank you very much, Fran. Thank you so much. An article can turn into a book, and it's an excellent way to gain the momentum necessary to produce a full-length work. Well, this is my 6th published book. My first one came out when I was a law student. It was an extension of my senior history thesis at the University of Virginia, and it's a history of Springfield, a little bit of Chicago as well, but primarily Springfield, and it covered our family history there and much more, much more. The Chicago book, Chicago, A Civic, Industrial, and Familial History, is about much more than our family. The family history is the foundation of the narrative. It is the skeletal structure that holds it together, but there are a vast number of other people in the book who are not our relatives, so you're not just reading about our family. But the family, in January, we're celebrating our family's 215th year in Chicago. And Jean du Sable was here first. We came right after him. We came right after. Our earliest ancestors here were the Wolcotts and the Kinseys. And that's part of the extended family through my mother. And we'll get to that in a second. But so this book has 8 chapters, a prologue and an epilogue, and 4 different banks of photographs. The book follows a chronological line, approximately. You can't be absolutely chronological, many chapters overlap, but generally chronological from oldest to most recent. The book is 828 pages and contains 5,751 footnotes. The reason why there are so many footnotes, there are actually a few. One, people in the past have said, this can't be true, you must be making this up. And I said, well, I can understand how some of the stories may seem extraordinary, they are, but they are also genuine. And also being somebody trained in law, I felt it important to use a legal scientific method for footnoting so that nobody could come back in and say, well, where are your sources? Now they're here, all 5,751 of them. And most of the sources are original journals, newspapers, interviews, letters, oral memoirs, things like that. And then legal records, all sorts, corporate documents, architectural records, contracting records, everything. And it took 17 years and 4 months of collection to produce all this as a database to work with. So there are probably over 1,000 people in the book. Yeah, we may have a few folks coming in late. There are probably over 1,000 people in the book altogether, and they're certainly not all our relatives, but the overwhelming majority of them are. But we have that big of a family. I've counted at least 33 different branches of the family from Chicago. Some have died out entirely. Others have continued and are very big. I'm just one of a tremendous number of descendants. It's not just me. But and we do not all know each other. Yeah, come on in. Welcome. Thank you for coming. So the family history here connects to many different points in Chicago history, from Fort Dearborn to the Great Fire to the World's Fair of 1893, the World's Fair of 1933, a great deal of the construction technology here that was innovative here, a great deal of railroading, meatpacking, coal, oil, steel. Every side of the family almost was involved with industry in some form, and we had every level of the socioeconomic spectrum. We had janitors, dishwashers, homemakers, school teachers, and we had people who were financiers and industrialists and judges and attorneys, and we had everybody. And the book covers the janitors and dishwashers with everyone else. They're just as important to me, not as much as stated about them, simply because they don't have as much historical record. unfortunately. But they are in the book. I have pictures of them where possible. And so you will be reading about people who lived at the YMCA. My great uncle Charlie lived at the YMCA, the Lawson YMCA. But then you'll be reading about my ancestor John Stryker, who founded the first railroads ever to connect to Chicago from the East Coast. And so we're just as proud. We're very happy with every part of this history, and this history belongs to everybody. This is not mine in the sense of proprietorship. This is everybody's history. I have a unique relationship to it, and I want everyone else to have his or her own unique relationship to these histories. Everyone possesses a unique stewardship with respect to this. This is not mine, it is everybody's. And that's one reason my mother said you have to share this, and I said you're absolutely right. And that is what everyone should do. When they have that unique sense of stewardship, share it so that everyone else may claim their unique stewardship of it as well. And I write about that in my prologue. So I've broken this up. We're going to focus on the Hyde Park Township sides of the family in this presentation. This is my first book from 2005, The History of Springfield. And I still have family in Springfield as well, in Cass County and Morgan area. So we had roots all over the state. We first came to Illinois in 1804 to Fort Dearborn. And so I'm technically, if you count the different generations, although I was not born and raised here, I was born in the Everglades region of Florida and raised in the Appalachian Mountains of Virginia, and baptized on the shores of Lake Michigan. So I really do claim many places as home. I'm from more than one place. I'm not from Chicago originally. I'm from Roanoke and Rocky Mount, Virginia, the coal country. And I grew up in coal country.
Snow covered today.
Yes. And I was born in a town called Boynton Beach, Florida, which is technically in the Everglades. And right on the ocean, but that's the Everglades. And I still go back to visit. My grandparents were from Illinois and chose a home down there in the 1960s to get away from the winter. They talked my mother and father into moving, and so Florida became a part of our home as well. So I'm from more than one place, like many people in this book are as well. But I felt a draw to come back here over many years, and I've been here about 11 and a half years now. I live in the north side. I used to live downtown. And I'd like to, the way things are looking, I really would like to stay in Chicago the rest of my years. This is my favorite city. Cleveland and Pittsburgh are right behind it, where my father's family's from. But this region is very special to me. The entire Midwest is home for me and has been since I was very young, along with Virginia. And I would like to stay based in the area, and Chicago for me will always be the center. So here are some of our family surnames from the city. These are just a few, of course. So if you can't read that, I'll read these. Wolcott, Kinsey, Whiting, Post, Henshaw, they lived right here in Hyde Park. Willard, Stryker, they lived in Woodlawn. Douglas, Call, of course, my last name Taylor, my middle name is my mother's maiden name. Bunn, Reagan, no relation to the president. McNeil, Richardson, Hogan, Hanrahan, Jones, Ferguson, Downs, Cogan, McKay, Driscoll, Peterson, Dodson, and there are many others. But this is just a survey. And over 214 years, they spread from the very center of the original downtown, Fort Dearborn and Kinsey House and Wolcott House, which is now State and Wacker, where Marina Towers stands. They spread from there to the entire city. We had family everywhere from Rogers Park to Beverly, and from Cicero to Waukegan, from Joliet to Gary, from New Lenox to Lake Forest. And it's that big of a family. I've counted, I think, over 75 suburbs that the families resided in, and almost every single part of the city. There are 77 communities within the city of Chicago. Officially, I've found family connections to over 50%. Yes, all the way from the top to the yeah. And so in the different ways, our ancestors were Scottish, English, Irish, Dutch, and German. Many came here very poor with nothing, and then had to work their way up. Others came here with some means. Others came here with a lot. So there were different stories of opportunity and experience. So these are some of our earliest family members here. Dr. Alexander Wolcott, born February 14, 1790 in Middletown, Connecticut, died 1830. He married the daughter of John Kinsey, Ellen Marion Kinsey, which is celebrated as the first wedding in Chicago history. One caveat about that, Whistler, Colonel Whistler, or Captain Whistler, married here at Fort Dearborn earlier than that, but, and I do mention that in the book to be fair, but the city of Chicago has very often considered the Kinsey-Wolcott wedding to be the first in the city's history. John Harris Kinsey was John Kinsey's son, and he's a relative by marriage. I'm a Wolcott by blood. The Kinseys married, two Kinseys married two Wolcotts. The Kinseys became cousins. So it's all conjoined family. John Harris Kinsey co-founded the Chicago Historical Society and the Chicago Board of Trade. Dr. Alexander Wolcott owned all the real estate that became North State Street. It was originally Wolcott Street. There's now a Wolcott Avenue named for him that runs from Howard to 87th Street in Inglewood, 20 miles long in the city limits, and everyone here probably knows Kinsey Street as well. So those are some of the earliest ancestors. Juliet McGill Kinsey, another cousin of ours who survived, all these people survived the Battle of Fort Dearborn. They were friends with the Native American chiefs, very close friends with them. They spoke the languages. And at the Wolcott-Kinsey wedding, which was July 20th, 1823, all the local Native American chiefs came and celebrated at the party as family. They viewed the Kinseys and Wolcotts as family. Chief Chechapinkwe, his European name was Alexander Robinson, and Chief Sauganash, a.k.a. Billy Caldwell, they were all there. Juliet McGill Kinsey wrote the book on the right, Wabun, which is roughly translated to Glorious Morning, a history of the Old Northwest Territories. And she also resided not only here in Chicago, but in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and then came back later, and she married John Harris Kinsey on the right. And she was the niece of Dr. Alexander Wolcott on the left. So those are some of our earliest family members here, and they actually resided at Fort Dearborn when the federal government decommissioned the fort and did not need the fort as a military outpost any longer. It became abandoned property, the Wolcotts acquired it and resided there, and then when the federal government needed it again, they recommissioned it. So Fort Dearborn was technically family property at one time. Other ancestors that were early here, Robert Irwin from St. Louis. He served on the board of directors of the first bank in Chicago history and helped, which was based in Springfield actually, but they had a Chicago branch. First bank here is the State Bank of Illinois. He was on one of the first boards of directors, not the very first, but still very early. And he is my great-great-great-great-granduncle. Born 1806, November 7th. The man on the right, Reverend Trumas Marcellus Post, born June 3rd, 1811. He is another great-great-great-granduncle. Actually, so it's one generation closer. He founded the Chicago Theological Seminary, which originally was founded in Lincoln Park, but then moved to Hyde Park later, and now it's in Woodlawn. So he was the chief founder and the founder of the board of directors and the first chairman, and he helped develop the Congregational Church in Chicago and St. Louis. So he's considered a city father of St. Louis and Chicago. Yes, sir.
Is he one of the Yale group?
Middlebury College.
Okay, Middlebury. Then.
Middlebury.
Okay. And I not count they're in Baldwin of the Yale.
Baldwin.
Where Baldwin would be down in central Illinois.
Oh, is that town? Okay.
Alton.
Oh, Alton area. He resided in St. Louis, and he had also lived in Jacksonville, so he probably went through Godfrey and Alton quite a few times.
Okay.
Yeah, and Ron White here, his ancestors were founders of Godfrey, Illinois, the Godfrey family, so they're also founding families of Illinois.
Andrew?
Yes.
What's the relationship between Post and the Chicago Theological Seminary?
He's the main founder.
Yeah, but the McCormick Seminary.
That's Presbyterian. This is
Okay,
congregation.
fine, thank you. Okay, I wanted to check on that, thank you.
Now another relative that we'll get to later, Reverend Melanchthon Stryker, was on the board of the McCormick Theological Seminary. He was the fourth pastor of Fourth Presbyterian Church. I'm also a Stryker. That's another very old name in Chicago and in Michigan. And
Yes.
and they were also here very early, and they lived in Woodlawn. So these are some of the earliest people. We're going to dive down to Hyde Park here in a second. After the Great Chicago Fire of October 8th and 9th, 1871, another one of our relatives, Alexander Wolcott, not the one I just showed you a picture of, but his nephew, son of Henry Wolcott, his brother, started Wolcott and Fox, which is hard to read here, but it's that lower rectangle sign on the left of the building, the first real estate agency after the fire in Chicago. And Kerfoot is at the top. William Dale Kerfoot, who's presumably standing in front of the building, he was the first actual land broker here. Wolcott, I misspoke. Kerfoot was your first real estate broker. Wolcott and Fox was your first land surveyor here in the burnt out district after the fire. And they were friends and shared a building. So that building right there is the beginning of the new Chicago after the fire of 1871. And that's another one of our relatives, the other Alexander Wolcott. Okay, now we're going to come down into Hyde Park Township. Of course, Hyde Park Township was originally a gigantic suburb of Chicago and was annexed by the city in 1889. Paul Cornell, whose picture is on the wall here above Cleveland and Janice, he was the principal founder of Hyde Park Township. He was a lawyer and not industrialist, but a real estate developer. And we are not related to Paul Cornell, but he knew the family. We have proof that he knew the family. Now, This is my ancestor John Stryker through my grandfather Henry Stryker Taylor. He was from Rome, New York, which is upstate New York in Oneida County. And he was a lawyer. He was born December 1808, died 1886, I believe. He founded the following companies that connected to Chicago and were here. He founded the Michigan Southern Railroad Company, the first railroad ever to connect Chicago to the East Coast, 1851. He started the Lake Shore Northern Indiana Railroad Company, the Northern Indiana and Chicago Railroad Company. He co-founded the Rock Island Railroad Company. He helped develop Beverly, Morgan Park, Washington Heights, and Mount Greenwood, indirectly, because he founded the railroad, the Rock Island, that enabled those communities to develop later. And he also was an indirect founder of Greater Grand Crossing, because the Michigan Southern Railroad came through, and on the picture on the left is a picture of the Grand Crossing, after which the community takes its name. That's the Illinois Central Railroad Company and the Michigan Southern. And they had a famous railroad war after a collision took place over the rights of way, which I write about in chapter 2. Then John Stryker also was co-founder of the New York Central and Hudson River Railroad, which was the largest corporation in the world by 1846 and was a approximately $1.2 billion corporation by 1900. So our Stryker ancestors were among the founders of around 20 different railroads in Chicago, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and New York City. And necessarily everything connected to New York at that time. But they were among the very first railroad people in Chicago history. And many of them resided here. It's an immense family. The Strykers are huge, and many of them don't even have the last name like me, but it's a very big family. Greater Grand Crossing was part of Paul Cornell's development. He is the principal founder of Greater Grand Crossing, but he did build it on Stryker's Crossroads, which is what you see in that picture. And again, all that right there was connected to the Michigan Southern Railroad, which is right here in its station. It had a very large train station in the city at one time. That is before the Great Fire. And that was John Stryker's train station. And then he also connected all the railroads that went over through Michigan City. A lot of those cities that are on the southern shore of Lake Michigan were developed because of Stryker's railroads, including the town of Stryker, Ohio, which is between Toledo and the Indiana border. So, as you can see, we have multiple sources of Hyde Park Township here, both as an independent corporation and municipality and as a suburb of Chicago and later as a huge piece of Chicago. We have railroad founders coming in from New York. We have people like Paul Cornell, who are businessmen and lawyers coming in from the east. And then we have settlers coming in, different European migrations coming in here. And the railroad was key. The railroad was key. Since Greater Grand Crossing and Hyde Park Township were about the first place you encountered coming into Illinois from Indiana, around the southern shore of Lake Michigan, it would be a very important point of arrival for people coming to the Chicago metropolitan area. So Paul Cornell, we always want to put him first in the history of Hyde Park Township. And then we put people like John Stryker and Frank Jones, and then the other railroad men right there behind him, because they helped develop it as an industrial zone and as a transportation point. Some other early relatives of ours, Andrew Cunningham, came from Edinburgh, Scotland. He is my great-great-great-grand uncle, born 1806. He was from Edinburgh. He came here to Chicago in 1834 when there were only 3,000 people here. Then he moved downstate to Cass County and started a tannery, a large tannery company. And so he came in and out of Chicago a lot and resided here for a while. In the early 1830s, as Chicago was still a village, it was not yet a city. It wouldn't become a city until March 4th, 1837. The man on the right, Robert Taylor, is my great-great-grandfather. He came from Campbelltown, Scotland, and came to Chicago in 1840 when there were approximately 5,000 people in the city. And then he also went down and lived outside of Springfield in Cass County. So, as I said, we have roots in southern and central Illinois as well. But Chicago is definitely a central place, because every part of the family pretty much was connected here in some form. For my mother's family. Some of Dad's family from Cleveland and Pittsburgh and Columbus as well. Now, this Robert Taylor is no connection to the namesake of the famous housing project. But it is the same name, but it's a different person. But that is my great-great-grandfather. He has a tremendous number of descendants, and there have been many descendants of his in Chicago over the generations. One of them lived right up the street here. We'll get to him towards the end of the presentation. My great-great-great-grandfather, Jacob Bunn, and my great-great-great-granduncle, John Whitfield Bunn, were very active in Chicago as industrial leaders. They were Abraham Lincoln's financiers, and they chaired and financed Abraham Lincoln's 1860 presidential campaign. Lincoln was our family's banker. He was our attorney. We were his bankers. We still have a piece of furniture at home my mother has. It was my crib when I was a baby, and it was called the Lincoln bed. It's not quite as dramatic as it sounds. It was actually just a bench, but Lincoln would hang his coats on it when he came to the house. 5 generations of the family, we've kept it in the family. Jacob Bunn owned the largest newspaper in Chicago, the Inter-Ocean.
Oh, really?
Yes, and he founded it. He was the founder, and it was originally called the Chicago Republican. Founded it in 1865 with $500,000, and it was meant to be Abraham Lincoln's main Republican Party organ, and then no one foresaw that 3 months later Lincoln would be assassinated. Because they incorporated the company in January, February of 1865. Lincoln was killed in April of 1865. Nevertheless, the paper continued till 1912 under various ownerships. Jacob Bunn owned it, and when he owned it, he was the co-founder with John Farwell, Jonathan Young Scammon, who founded Oakwood Cemetery, and a number of other people. Jesse Kilgore Du Bois, and a number of other founders, all were the incorporators of the company. Then Jacob Bunn ended up buying them all out as co-founder. And it was the largest newspaper in Chicago and the largest in the entire American West. They had an annual circulation of 11 million papers by 1877.
Andrew, it covered the Royal Columbian Exposition.
That's right. It
Yeah.
would have been one of the major pieces.
It was.
Yeah. By that point, Jacob Bunn had gone bankrupt, though. He didn't own the paper in 1893. He suffered from the Panic of 1873
Oh, okay.
and lost about $2 or $3 million in 1871. And he never recovered that money, but he paid back all of his bank depositors as a matter of integrity. And the family was and still is, and so am I, we're all Christian. And he had a sense of Christian moral ethics in his work. And he paid back all of his depositors. He paid back 5,000 people with no legal obligation to do so. The bankruptcy court said he didn't have to. He said, but I have a moral and faith-based obligation to do so. John Whitfield Bunn co-founded, well, they both were among the major developers of the Chicago Union Stockyards. Jacob is much older than John, but they developed much of the stockyards. They were meat packers. And Jacob Bunn and John Stryker, who I just showed you a minute ago, John Stryker and Jacob Bunn started 3 of the 9 railroad companies that started the stockyards. There were 9 railroads that cooperated. They did not merge, but they cooperated to start the Chicago Union Stockyards. Of the 9, 3 of them were family companies. The Chicago and Alton Railroad Company, the Michigan Southern Railroad Company, and the Rock Island Railroad Company. Those were all part of our family, my mother's family. So, and then John Whitfield Bunn came in later and helped develop the stockyards as the world center of the meatpacking industry, and also as what we call the socioeconomic center of the whole meatpacking industry for the world. He co-founded the Saddle and Sirloin Club, which was based at the stockyards, founded in 1903, and then it burned down, and it ended when the stockyards ended in the early 70s. But John Whitfield Bunn founded the Wabash Railroad in 1889. That was a $131 million corporation in 1889. And he and Jay Gould were the main founders of the Wabash. And John was president of the Wabash Railroad of Chicago for quite a while. He also was the founding treasurer of the Illinois Board of World's Fair Commissioners for the 1893 World's Fair. He owned the oldest grocery company in the United States, and he started Wishbone Food Brands, if anyone here remembers. Yeah, that was my great-great-grandfather owned Wishbone Coffee and all the Wishbone brands, and then my great-grandfather sold it off later to Lipton Tea, well, to another company that sold it to Lipton Tea, but Wishbone was started by our family here in Illinois. And then they had Abe Lincoln Coffee, there was Old Timer Coffee, JWB brand, all the different food brands here. John Whitfield Bunn and Jacob Bunn together, if you put them together, had built up, co-founded, and helped develop around $500 to $600 million worth of companies by 1900. And that's $500 to $600 million in $1,900. Yeah. And that's not personal wealth, that's the corporate assets, but they were the 2 of the key founders and builders and owners and directors of those companies that had that value cumulatively. If you add in John Whitfield Bunn's portrait on the left is in Louisville, Kentucky. It used to hang in Chicago at the Union Stockyards, but when the stockyards closed in the 70s, Louisville brought all the pictures down there, over 300 portraits, to continue the Industrial Museum. Yes, and then there he is on the right. He died in 1920. He also co-founded the University of Illinois. He was the founding treasurer of the University of Illinois system and one of the fathers of the land-grant university system. He served 37 years on the board of trustees of the University of Illinois. And he also was, again, he was treasurer of the board, the Illinois Board of Directors for the World's Fair of '93. He co-founded the Seltz Schwab Shoe Company of Chicago, which was the world's largest shoe and boot maker. They had 15 factories in Chicago, Gary, and Pittsburgh, and Elgin. and were outfitting the entire French army in individual contracts. He was in business with Morris Seltz, who co-founded the University of Chicago, and who was one of the prominent Jewish entrepreneurs in the city. And something we're very proud of in our family is that our family, who were Presbyterian Christians, were very close friends with and were in very close business associations with Jewish families in the city in the 1800s, and that's something that was uncommon at that time.
Hey, Andy, we're going to have to dig into Francis Arnold Hoffman, and Lieutenant Governor of Illinois, banker, and it was the, what's his name? He bought the bank from, he was also a founder of the Standard.
Oh, yes.
The Standard being at that time, it was about half Hebrew and half Evangelical Lutheran.
That's what you'd mentioned, and I never knew about the Lutheran membership. Now, Morris Seltz, whom I just mentioned.
Yes, he was in there too.
Yeah.
The architect, August Bauer, city architect of Chicago, he was in there.
He was there too, and so was Alfred Austrian and Julius Rosenbaum. They joined as well. And, and interesting though, two generations of our family were in business with two generations of the Seltzes. And again, at that time, that was an unusual phenomenon from a sociological standpoint. Yes, Joe?
Until, I can't remember, the mid-1980s, on the wall of a building in the Loop, there was a painted ad for the Seltz Shoe Company.
Oh, that's good to know. There's still some around. Yes, that's great to know, Joe. Well, Seltz became...
Wait, was that their factory building?
No, no.
Or just there?
Probably just an
I
advertisement.
think they were in the Loop someplace, but I don't have to remember.
They were on Monroe Street, I believe. But remember now, they have 14 buildings in Chicago.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they were originally in the Loop. They bought the old George, I can't think of his name, I'm sorry, the building in Elgin. They acquired the building in Elgin that is now the Shoe Factory Apartments. But Seltz, Schwab and Company grew to such an immense size that by 1900 they were billed regularly as the world's largest manufacturer of shoes and boots. They made over 6,000 varieties, and for men, women, and children. And in terms of distributorships, and by distributorships I mean sales agencies, the company operated over 30,000 sales distributorships from Chicago by 1900 around the world.
I think they went out as a depression.
They did, yes, and our family and the Seltzes liquidated it in 1931. Then, going back here again, this portrait of John Whitfield Bunn is a very large portrait painted by the famous artist Cecilia Bow, who was connected to John Singer Sargent. She was featured at the Art Institute's Sargent exposition recently. John was the main force behind the Wabash Railroad here in Chicago, and he and Jacob were, as I said, co-founders of around 10 railroad corporations at least in Chicago and Springfield, and a little out of St. Louis. But they were really from both places. They were from Chicago and Springfield. So again, like many of the people in the book, and like so many people in history, they're from more than one place. Excuse me. Here are the Union Stockyards. This is a great picture of the stockyards. So again, the size of our family, 3 branches of my mother's family and 1 branch of my father's family were among the major developers of the stockyards. Bunn, Stryker from Mom's family, and Call Dodson from my father's family, who came later, because we'll get to that at the very end. But the Bunns were active with the stockyards and the Strykers as well from its inception all the way through the middle 20th century, or early 20th century. Here's the Saddle and Sirloin Club on the right, with the original portrait collection. And John Bunn's portrait now hangs in Springfield. That's a separate one from the one in Louisville that used to hang in Chicago. So maybe in that picture we can't see, but his portrait is in there. That was the World Center, that room right there basically, that building, and for purposes to add a little drama, that room was the world center of the meatpacking industry. Any decisions made in that industry that really governed the industry were made right there by those people, who were farmers, stockmen, and agribusiness industrial leaders like John Bunn and Jacob Bunn. The world was governed from Chicago when it came to food production and meatpacking. It was also the world center of railroads. It was the world center of shoes, boots, and leather. Boston would be, and St. Louis would be close on behind it. And it was the world center of multiple forms of shipping and manufacturing. And at one time we were the largest steel producer in the world. So John and Jacob Bunn were responsible for many of these companies, and it's unusual that they were behind so many of these companies at one time. I've traced them to over 70 organizations in Illinois alone, just in 70 years, 80 years. When Schwab Company went out of business in 1931, it did leave behind a spin-off, Cole Haan. Cole Haan, 3 salesmen at Schwab decided to salvage the largest factory left in this company system in 1931. Edward Hahn, C. Trafton Cole, and Murdoch McGregor and Charles Simpson decided to salvage that factory. They got it at a huge discount from the owners, the Bunns and the Seltzes and the Schwabs, and then turned it into Cole Haan, which itself became a great world-class large manufacturer of shoes and boots and still exists today. It was sold off to Nike, and then from Nike to a private equity firm. But Shoeless Joe Jackson was employed by our family in the Seltzes as a spokesman. And it says, when he wears them, Shoeless Joe wears Seltz shoes. But then later on, as a very strange turn of irony, he would later be indicted by the Cook County grand jury for the Black Sox scandal, and the foreman of that grand jury was my grandfather's cousin.
Oh, no.
So one side of my family hired Joe Jackson, the other side fired him. Yeah, and some people have never forgiven me for that. Here's one of the Seltz Schwab factories right here downtown. As you can see, the Seltz flags are flying.
Yeah.
They owned their own railroad here in Chicago, and they had their own fleet of trucks. And again, they distributed globally. They outfitted much of the British Army, the entire French Army, and much of the U.S. Army. And they were, again, operating 30,000 sales agencies by 1900. Okay, here's a postcard with all their poster with all their factories on it. The one at the very top is in Elgin. That's still standing, by the way. Pittsburgh had a few, and Gary, Indiana had one. Okay, now we're going to dive back into Hyde Park. Here's the map of the Wabash Railroad. The Wabash Railroad was very important in this area, in the south side of Chicago, because as you can see, it connects the southern. I'm going to squeeze over here for 1 second to point something out. I've coined a term. Well, I won't say that I'm the only one who's ever said it, but I'm the only one I've seen who's said it so far. For this region of Chicago here, this area here that goes from the south side around Lake Michigan, in the watershed of the Calumet River, the Grand Calumet and the Little Calumet, I've coined a phrase called the Calumet Corridor, because I believe the area is so important historically. Sorry, Cleveland, I'll get back in the class here. The area is so important historically, it deserves its own name, other than just northwestern Indiana or south side Chicago. It should be called the Calumet Corridor, which is both south side of Chicago, Hyde Park Township, and Lake County, Porter County, and LaPorte County, Indiana. You could even take it a little farther south, too, down past Cherville and Merrillville. That area was very special to us. It's always been very special to me emotionally. I've always had a deep love for this city. I first came here at age 11, and it cast a spell on me then. And Hyde Park was one of my first visits here. We went to the Museum of Science and Industry and the Roby House. So for me, the city, I just knew even from a long time ago that I wanted to move here and become a part of the city. I didn't know back then how much family we had from here, so the book has been a very special rediscovery of much of that history. So again, the Wabash Railroad was one of the family companies and helped develop the south side of Chicago and the Calumet Corridor, and it took it all the way to Pittsburgh. It never made it farther than Pittsburgh. It went bankrupt then. Competing with the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central Railroad is devastating, and you just can't do it. So it ended up collapsing into oblivion in 1912, and the pieces of the company were reacquired by other railroads.
An interesting aspect of that, Gould owned all the poles for the Western Union Telegraph.
Okay. That's a good
And that
contract,
did
yeah.
not save the fourth route, transcontinental.
Interesting.
Which is that terminal that they had at Pittsburgh.
That's very interesting. I never knew that.
Architect for the Pittsburgh terminal was Theodore Link of St. Louis. The details for the interior decorations and all that was Louis Millet of Chicago.
Oh, Louis Millet, yes.
And at that same time, Louis Millet was also doing the finishing for the Pennsylvania's big terminal with all that Chicago terracotta at
That's
Pittsburgh.
fascinating.
1904. Oh, and Louis Millet was also, and Theodore Link were also involved in the building the new state capitol in Jackson, Mississippi.
Okay, that's great, because you've talked to me a lot about Louis Millet, and he's one of our underrepresented heroes in Chicago architecture and design.
Right.
Thank you all for coming. Come on in. So one difference between John Whitfield Bunn and Jay Gould was this, I would say, and I don't believe this is an unfair statement. Gould was very much a speculator. And he made a tremendous amount of money in speculation and had a terrible reputation. They called him the werewolf of Wall Street, and I've never admired him terribly. John Whitfield Bunn, who most people have never heard of, believed in building great companies in great places and staying loyal to the place that enabled you to do what you did. Because John Bunn started with nothing. He started in, the Bunn brothers were born in Hunterdon County, New Jersey, on a farm in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. And John, this is a true story, we have a letter in which he describes this. When he was about 16 years old, his older brother Jacob had already been in Illinois for about a decade and had become established as a grocery merchant in Springfield. He went back to New Jersey to ask his youngest brother, would you want to come to Illinois with me? And I'll give you a start. John stood there with a wheelbarrow filled with rocks. He was picking up rocks on the family farm. And that's poor farmland. Western New Jersey is not good farmland, especially not compared to the Midwest. He looked up and said to his older brother, I believe, Jacob, I'd love to come out there and live in the Midwest and to start over. Jacob said, well, just wait a couple months and I'll send for you. I called that in my first book and in this book, The Wheelbarrow Dialogue. John Whitfield Bunn started as an impoverished teenager, picking up stones in a wheelbarrow in New Jersey, in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, to becoming the co-founder of the University of Illinois, a father of the U.S. land-grant university system, the founder of the Wabash Railroad, a co-founder of the Chicago World's Fair, co-founder of Chicago's greatest shoe and boot company and the world's greatest, a founder of many other railroads here in the city, and a very active member of the Chicago Club, the Chicago Historical Society, and the Union League Club. And at one time he did control the Republican Party of Illinois. It was a very different party back then and stood for very different principles. And he would be very unhappy with much of what's happened to it today. John and Jacob Bunn were essentially, you could consider this an accusation or a compliment, or maybe a mix of both, a very interesting cocktail of language. Chicago Mayor Long John Wentworth was a business partner of the Bunns, and he was a good friend, and he's featured prominently in the book. He co-founded the Chicago Board of Education. He stood 6 feet 6 inches tall. They called him the Giant from New England, who conquered Chicago. That was his nickname. He said of John and Jacob Bunn, they control the whole city, they control the whole state. They own the big newspapers, they control the Republican Party, and no one who gets elected to office can do anything without going through them. So people could say that the Bunn family and a few other, the interrelated families, they really did run the city of Chicago at one time. In the late 1800s, during the golden age of industrialization, the Bunns did control the politics here. Carter Harrison was a Democrat and couldn't stand it. But Long John Wentworth and the other Republican mayors here were very good friends of the Bunns and worked with them very closely. Wentworth was friendly but critical. Hang on just one moment, okay? Thank you. He was critical but friendly, and he did say John and Jacob Bunn controlled the State House and the city of Chicago. So there was a time when John and Jacob Bunn, who were actually very honorable men, who knew what it was like to have nothing, and they gave a lot back. And Jacob ended up dying in poverty. He gave everything back to people. They were a powerful political machine here that was actually much stronger than anything you see today, and I do mean that, because the ones today don't control the railroads and the banks. These people did. And they used that power to redistribute it and help people. They started orphanages, churches, schools, hospitals. They said, we owe this to God and to our community to give this back. So I use the word machine in a neutral sense. It was a machine in the sense that it had great power. It was not corrupt in the sense that we think of corrupt machines. If I may be, again with full disclosure, a defender of the ancestors here, the historical record shows that they did have that power here. The historical record also shows a very benevolent attitude and work ethic and faith ethic with these people. But at one time, the Bunn brothers did run Chicago politics. The Springfield Iron Company here was the world's largest maker of angle splice bars, which go into making railroad crossings. And John Bunn was co-founder and vice president of that. Now, I'd like to bring in a very important piece of African-American history here. John and Jacob Bunn and William Douglas Richardson and George Brinkerhoff and Charles Ridgely hired Granville Taylor Woods of Ohio, an African-American inventor born April of 1856 in Columbus, Ohio, to work for them when he was a young man. This is a time when that was not common, to give someone an opportunity to work in a position that had high-level training. Granville Taylor Woods is the most important and famous person in terms of electrical history and invention history who ever worked for that company. No one today remembers John Bunn, Jacob Bunn, or William Richardson, or George Brinkerhoff. But Granville Taylor Woods, who got his start working for the Bunn brothers and these other men in Springfield, went on to become one of the greatest electrical inventors in history. He was considered the equal to Thomas Edison. He had a tremendous portfolio of patents, and he invented modern railroad signaling systems for the whole world. He is the one who created the systems that prevented the train accidents. And he was an African-American inventor from Columbus, Ohio. He went back to Cincinnati and started his own company to manufacture electrical machinery. And so something else we're very proud of in our family, if I may put it that way, is that they hired him at a time when that was an unusual thing to do.
But,
Is this an untold story, or is this something that's...
Granville Taylor Woods is actually very famous,
Okay.
but it's untold that he worked for John and Jacob Bunn.
now, was that company, how does Sangamo come into that?
There's no connection.
Okay,
Yeah, no connection, that's coincidence.
right,
That is an electrical company, but Woods had nothing to do with that. The Bunns did, but Woods didn't.
right, because the railroads were more of illuminated semaphores,
That's right.
whereas, and some cable links,
Yes.
whereas Sangamo was a company manufacturer of
Meters
and
sonar. We're going to get to that at the end, Ron.
yes,
That's at the end.
solenoids. Things
Yeah,
like
yeah,
that.
that's right. Now, that's a very good point, but they're actually disconnected.
Right.
Granville Woods, though, he's considered one of the world's greatest inventors, one of the greatest American geniuses, and he is considered, and he truly is, an equal to Thomas Edison, and one of the first African Americans to go on to such global fame as an inventor and manufacturer. And he did have his start here in Illinois. Springfield Iron Company later would go on to make a tremendous amount of the railroad track for Chicago and Springfield and St. Louis and the Midwest. They later they became a part of Republic Steel in 1899, so they became one of many different companies that joined to create Republic Steel, which was a $55 million steel and iron trust in 1899. So the Bunn brothers were among the founders of and the Ridgeleys, who are not related to me, were very good friends of the family, were among the founders of Republic Iron and Steel. And right after its formation, William Barrett Ridgeley became Secretary-Treasurer of it here in Chicago. And that became the world's third largest steel maker. U.S. Steel, Bethlehem Steel, Republic, and then Armco Steel in that order. Okay, now we're jumping in. The rest of the presentation is all Hyde Park. I had to give you that background to show you the book is about the whole city and the region, but a lot of the family is from the Hyde Park Township of the city. This is my other great-great-great-grandfather, William Douglas Richardson, born July of 1837 in the mountains of Connecticut, northwestern Connecticut. He's Appalachian. He was born very poor, did not have the money to go to school. He learned carpentry and construction as an apprentice. He came to Chicago very young because he knew the city was going to have a great future, and he knew that there were a lot of building opportunities here for someone who was trained in carpentry. He moved to Springfield as well, and he married my great-great-great-grandmother, Lucy Willard, whose family had been in Chicago since the very early period of the city. And Frances Willard's a distant cousin, the temperance activist, a distant cousin. He came to Chicago and developed a very famous reputation as a building contractor. Again, no formal education. One reason he probably came here is that his uncle, Leonard Richardson, he owned the Barnum and Richardson Company, which manufactured railroad parts, wheels, train elements, and track pieces. It became the largest manufacturer of railroad construction pieces in the whole world, and it existed for almost 100 years. And it had a huge factory, several factories in Chicago, out on Clinton Street, Jefferson Street, and other places out on Robie Avenue back then, which is now Damon. So they were Chicago's largest railroad components manufacturer and the largest in the world. So his uncle co-founded and co-owned that with Milo Barnum, who was P.T. Barnum's third cousin. And then their son, Milo Barnum Richardson, who was a first cousin of William Douglas Richardson, he continued it and also became a founder of the World's Fair of '93. William Douglas Richardson built the state capitol in Springfield. He built the foundation of the Colorado State Capitol. He built a tremendous number of hotels and churches in Chicago. He built the City Hall of Grand Rapids, Michigan. He built the City Hall of Rockford, where the whole top caved in and caused a huge accident, and then he got sued. but he insisted there was some other error or something, but the whole dome, huge stone cupola dome, caved in 1877. But he recovered from that reputational mishap.
Were
And
were there deaths?
I don't remember. There may have been
Because
their
they-
injuries.
Yeah.
Yeah. He built a lot of courthouses in Ohio and Indiana, city halls, and he built a tremendous amount right here. Now, William Douglas Richardson is 29 there, and he's probably in his late 50s in the right. Daniel Burnham admired his construction work. And when it came time for the World's Fair of 1893 to choose a building contractor to build the World's Fair, he was the contractor. William Douglas Richardson was the chief contractor for almost the entire World's Fair of 1893, but he never gets adequate recognition. Daniel Burnham is the chief architect, and then he had a whole team of other architects, right, Charlie? A whole staff, a cabinet of architects. Peabody, like Peabody and Stearns, and George Post Sullivan, and then artists and decorators like Louis Millay, and William D. Richardson is the person who was the contractor. And he supervised 60,000 workers in constructing the fair. The Richardson family is an immense family. They lived all over the city. Albany Park, Hyde Park, downtown, everywhere. They're a huge family. There are tons of them around. A lot of them, like me, don't have the last name Richardson, but they're Richardsons. And he was, his company, Richardson Construction Company, was grossing 30 to 50 million a year by 1891. Again, no one's heard of it. And now that's not profit, that's contract revenue, but the profits are still very big. But he ran the largest construction company in Chicago. He was based in the Loop. And he did multiple contracts simultaneously because he had a huge workforce available to him at different work sites. Now, what happened with the World's Fair was this. They couldn't figure out how to build all the buildings. To build it out of granite stone was going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars. That would not have been feasible, or would have been very impractical. Now, what happened here is there's some dispute over this, but there's a plaster material called staff. And what makes it special is that it's reinforced plaster. It contains sisal fiber or hemp fiber, and sometimes Portland cement to strengthen it. So it's not just raw plaster, it's plaster, but it's reinforced plaster. Many people who are the contemporaries of William D. Richardson at the World's Fair credited him as the inventor of it. And I quoted some of those newspapers that said so. Those journalists worked with him, knew him, and I believe they're reliable sources. Other scholars have said that staff already existed before that and was used at the Great Paris World's Fair where the Eiffel Tower was constructed. I discovered that after publication. So what I would say now is I say William D. Richardson was considered by some, but not all, to be the inventor of staff and the refiner of it as a building material. He definitely is the one who said, let's add the fibers to it to make it stronger. So you could consider him a father of it for the World's Fair, at least, if not for the whole construction industry. He is responsible for the White City. And people said, if you go back and read all the originals that I have in the book, he is the one who found out how to build all this when no one else could figure it out. He built all the major buildings, including the Manufacturers and Liberal Arts Building, which was a 35-acre building with a 35-acre roof. None of the official university, none of the university-trained engineers could figure out how to put a 35-acre roof on a building. He's the only person in the world who could do it. And he learned in the apprentice shop in the mountains, the Appalachian Mountains, and here in Chicago, in Springfield. So he supervised all the university men in doing this. They all worked for him. He built that building, and then he wrote extensively about it, and I have some of his interviews. I'm going to read a couple lines here for you in a minute. But he is the chief contractor for the World's Fair of 1893, and he was already world famous before that. He was good friends with Tsar Alexander III Alexandrovich, Tsar and Emperor of Russia, and he was friends with Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, who was the son of Alexander. They knew him socially somehow. I don't know how he came to know them, but he did.
Railroad building.
Railroad building, for sure. Now, here's what they did. They hired him. They hired Richardson Construction Company of Chicago to plan and build the Trans-Siberian Railroad of Russia and Asia. So Chicago people built the Tsar's Imperial Railway system from Moscow and St. Petersburg all the way to Vladivostok, which is located near the debouchement point of the Amur River. Manchuria, almost. Now known as the Heilongjiang River if you're in China, the Black Dragon River.
And the Tsars, because they didn't like their teeth, they came to Chicago to get dentists.
That's a good point. So William D. Richardson was not only a contractor for the Russian Empire to build their railroads for them, he knew them socially, and He built the entire St. Petersburg sewer system. He built the Imperial Waterworks for the Tsar in St. Petersburg. So much of St. Petersburg was built by a man from Chicago.
Water's not safe to drink.
Oh, and they hired the waterworks people in Chicago as consultants.
I didn't know that. That's fascinating. We see, once again, you see how this city, and this is something I stress in the book, this city helped build the whole world, the modern world. Chicago's at the center of it. And so William D. Richardson supervised about 100,000 people in Russia. At the same time, he was supervising 60,000 here.
Wow.
He was back and forth all the time. The government of Argentina hired him. We can go through a few buildings here. Janice, thank you for supplying the picture on the left. That picture's in the book. It's one of her postcards. The Fisher Building was built by William Douglas Richardson downtown on Van Buren Street. Van Buren in front of court, named for Lucius Fisher. That's a Richardson building. He and George D. Moulton, the company of Moulton and Richardson, was another construction company here in the city. And they built the Guarantee Building of Buffalo, the tallest building in Buffalo, New York, which is on the right, which still stands. They believe Buffalo had a great future. It did. It would become a great city of the world. And that was built by Chicago people. And Chicago took an interest in all the Great Lakes cities and all the cities that were growing. They wanted to help be a part of the growth of these cities. So here's some pictures of the World's Fair. Everything you see in these pictures was built by William Douglas Richardson and designed by all the famous architects that we've heard of, but no one knew who the contractors were. Now it's time that they get their recognition as well. So he built all of this. That's staff material, the white plaster you see there. All of this was Richardson Construction Company, and Daniel Burnham is the architect. Richardson manufactured over 1 million barrels of staff plaster just for the World's Fair in 1893, and in doing so, exhausted the entire sisal and hemp resources of the United States, and had to import from New Zealand, Australia, and Mexico. So something I like to point out about this, Hyde Park and Woodlawn, my father and I always like to say, became the center of the world for 6 months. From May 1st, 1893 until the day the fair closed. Jackson Park as a park, and Hyde Park, Kenwood, and Woodlawn as communities were the center of the world.
Well, it took a year and a half to build it, and that stuff
That's
had
right.
to survive over the winter.
That's exactly right.
That's why they chose certain hardwoods and certain coatings.
That's exactly it. And the whole world came here. You had over 27 million registered visitors, entry tabs with millions and millions of visitors. So this really was the center of the world. We defeated New York and all the other cities that were vying for the World's Fair to get it here. And many people were very discouraged about this, saying, well, Chicago's just a backwater. As I think Eric Larson talked about in an interview, he said it was viewed as an industrial backwater without much future. It would become the greatest, for us, the greatest city in the world. Everyone here thinks that too. So here's some other pictures of the White City. Now, this is one of my favorites. I want you to look at that for a minute. You see the scale, you see the people, and you see how big the buildings are. Again, the manufacturers in liberal arts buildings, 35 acres. Well, that's 1.3 million square feet under one roof. This is the construction, a wonderful artist's rendition of the construction of the manufacturers and liberal arts building. All those men you see there and all that machinery, it's Richardson Construction Company. But it's a ghost company in the sense that it always fades away and no one ever would bring it to the front. And all of chapter 5 talks about these people. And then the finished work, that's a very famous picture. Yeah. This is not in the book. Those women are standing, or that man and woman are standing on the roof of the building. They're standing on top of a 35-acre roof.
There's a searchlight over there in the corner.
No,
yes.
No, they're in the administration building, I think.
No, that's the manufacturers
and liberal arts.
Searchlight? They're standing on the manufacturers and liberal arts building.
The administration building's down this way.
Because I remember checking that, because I wanted to find a picture to show the scale. That's right. The manufacturer. The one where they're standing is the manufacturers and liberal arts building. According to the source I saw.
To that legend on that. So what was that? That would be the Fisheries building immediately on the right, just a little bit.
And the Yerkes telescope was in it.
Isn't that amazing?
That was in the manufacturer's building.
All right, folks, let me roll us along here because we still got some more slides. And we'll chat afterwards about this because this is all fascinating. And these are details I didn't come across. So this picture is Puerto Madero, Buenos Aires, Argentina. That is one of the world's largest port infrastructures. It is the government dock system of Argentina, and William Douglas Richardson of Chicago built it for $21 million in 1891. So he was doing the Argentinian port on the Rio de la Plata River for Argentina in the city of Buenos Aires. He was doing the Russian railroad system and the World's Fair all at the same time.
Wow.
Now, again, how many people have ever heard about the Richardson Construction Company of Chicago?
Until now. Until now.
Ron White knew about it. Ron knew a lot of it.
Well, no,
Ron knew a lot of it.
I've heard
She'd
so
heard
much
Kathy
more
about it.
since.
He's been very patient. An interesting story here. The government of Argentina decided to pay Richardson with 6 million acres of Argentina real estate. So technically our family owned 6 million acres of South America once. But then a coup happened and the president was thrown out of office and they said, Mr. Richardson, if you don't mind, we're just going to give you 27 million US dollars instead of 6 million acres. So he took that in 1891, approximately 92, they paid him 27 million US dollars. We don't know what happened to all that. But 6 million acres is the size approximately of Massachusetts. It's over 9,000 square miles, and all of that was one-time family property, but it was owned by Chicago people. So Chicago and Springfield people at one time were probably the largest landowners in South America, outside of the governments in South America. Then he came back up here, and there was a funny story about this. When they paid him, he was going to sell off that real estate, but then the coup happened, and then they brought him back, though. Even the new government that threw the previous government out of office said, we need this guy to build our buildings. So the change in government did not change the fact that he was viewed very highly, and that Chicago is considered the greatest city to go to for construction. He built a lot of the government buildings in Buenos Aires, too, that you see today. I don't believe he built the Casa Rosada, the president's mansion, the president's house, the executive house, but he built, I think, the legislative buildings.
Now, you know, a model for funding or for financing a construction project like that, you know, all that land, you have the model of the Farwells here in Chicago.
Yes, yes.
Building, you know, to build the state capitol in Austin.
Yeah, that's in my book. That's chapter 2.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, because the Farwells were very close friends of our family for 2 generations, and they worked together. They were partners together. Yeah, the Farwell, John Villiers Farwell, born 1825 in Painted Post, New York, and Charles Benjamin Farwell, born I think in 1823, also in Painted Post, New York.
It's a steel memory. Can I just say one other
Yes.
thing? Is the Farwell descendants today have lost their history and have asked our company to recreate that for them. They didn't even know that we already had all this taken care of.
Tell them to read chapter 2, the whole Farwell. Okay,
And build from there.
yeah, they were very good friends of our family generations ago. The Farwell family were very active in civic leadership here in Chicago. They owned the largest dry goods company in the world at one time. Marshall Field got to start working for John Farwell.
Yeah.
And Aaron Montgomery Ward got his start
Later was there.
working for Field. John Shedd got his start working for Field. So it's a chain of visionary leadership. John D. Rockefeller of Cleveland, Ohio, was a friend and partner of William D. Richardson, and they started with the Tsars of Russia, the Russian-American Direct Transportation Company, which was the largest Pacific fleet. And it was a $50 million company in 1891. Different sources say 37 million, 50 million. That's one or the other. It depends on which one you want to look at. I've never found anything other than those two. They put up a whole fleet of ships on the Pacific to run from Washington State to Vladivostok. Yes, but it didn't, you know, the Russian Revolution would happen in 1917, and then all of these relations fell apart later. But William Douglas Richardson from Chicago, John Davison Rockefeller from Cleveland, the 2 czars, Alexander died, and then Nicholas II, the Romanov dynasty, and then Collis P. Huntington, the Southern Pacific Railroad, I believe. They were all partners in developing these companies. So, again, Richardson's very much a part of Hyde Park's history. And he basically lived down here, as far as I know, during the World's Fair. And he had a lot of great memoirs that he shared in interviews with other people in other World's Fairs, like the Buffalo Pan-American Exposition in 1899. Okay, there a picture of the 2 czars. The father's on the left, the son's on the right. And they were both social friends of Richardson. They considered Chicago to be the key to building their railroad system, so I think that's a high compliment to the city.
And they love hunting out here in Kansas and Nebraska.
This is a picture of the construction. The Trans-Siberian Railroad was 5,000 miles long. And the article, his obituary in 1923 from Foley, Alabama, he had retired to Alabama due to health issues. Couldn't take the cold weather anymore. Richardson's buried down there on the Gulf. And a lot of Chicago people came and went from the Gulf to the Great Lakes. But his obituary said he was the principal builder of the Trans-Siberian Railway of Russia. Now that's a history of Chicago and Hyde Park that has been forgotten, but we bring it back here. Here's another picture of the men on the Trans-Siberian Railway. Again, you might ask, sorry, Cleveland, Hyde Park's connection to all this is that a Hyde Park contractor built all of this. Okay, Richardson's very much a part of Hyde Park, and Jackson Park, and Woodlawn. And his official positions at the World's Fair of 1893. First, he was superintendent of exterior coverings of buildings. Then, after Dion Geraldine left that position, Richardson left the position of superintendent of buildings.
Geraldine was the dewatering contractor.
Yeah, he did that too, but he also was in charge of the, he handled the buildings and grounds at one time, and then left, and then Richardson took his position. So Richardson became superintendent of buildings and grounds for the whole World's Fair. Then he also was superintendent of foundations of Jackson Park for the building foundations as well as the superstructures.
How did he have a connection with Frederick Law Olmsted?
Yes.
I never found any direct correspondence, but as the person in charge of all buildings and grounds, he must have conferred with Olmsted and his company extensively because of the nature of the work.
Olmsted was the director of the overall ground.
No, this is interesting. I went through a lot of court cases. In putting this together because, believe it or not, a lot of these family members have gotten into lawsuits.
But anyway, that's what I'm suggesting.
That's great, Kathy. Thank you very much.
That
and that's a
resource,
very good idea.
it's local.
Yeah, but in all these things, I've noticed that Richardson has really faded out of almost all the record databases. Most places have no record of it.
Yes.
Where I found him and, if I may use the term, reconstructed his biography, industrial trade journals, World's Fair newspaper reports, and interviews with him in other newspapers. It's amazing how a company...
And out of the city.
Yeah, a lot of them were out of the city. Yeah. Absolutely right. Ron's absolutely right. Because a lot of the Chicago records, for some reason, have been lost.
A professor in his hometown is a man with no honor.
What's so funny is that the largest construction company in Chicago would become such a phantom in Chicago history. So again, we tried to bring that back. There's Richardson standing on the right. That's his second wife, Clara Trim, from Madison, Wisconsin. The man on the left, we've never identified. Okay, here's another picture of the Trans-Siberian construction. Here's a picture of the map of the Trans-Siberian Railroad. That's 5,000 miles. Again, a Chicago man was the chief builder of that whole system.
Well, that railroad still operates.
It does. It does. And they've added numerous spurs to it as
And
well.
a lot of luxury trains go across.
Yes.
Too.
That's right, I've heard that. That would be fun to do sometime.
The Trans-Siberian.
This is the Vladivostok Bridge. That's on the Pacific Ocean. That is the end. That's the city where the railroad ends.
Is that a recent construction?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that's recent.
From about within the last 15 years.
I don't know. It didn't say what bridge it was.
The structure of the opening.
Yeah, you can tell by the design.
It looks like, I just got back from Italy, it looks like some of the new bridges in
Yeah,
Italy.
that,
And
Yeah,
there's
it
one
does.
in Charleston,
Yeah,
South
the new
Carolina, that
suspension
looks like
set, yeah.
that too.
It's a very modern design. You're absolutely right, Kathy.
Exactly.
Another connection here, Hyde Park people developing the West. Richardson was a major developer of Southern California cash crop regions. He helped develop the Kanager plant. I didn't know what that was until I was doing this research. It is a cousin of the rhubarb, but it's not as used as much in cooking pies. It's used in creating tannin for tanning leather.
oh,
So it's not so much it's not a thing you find in a cookbook very much, but he helped develop about many thousands of acres of Kanager groves in San Bernardino County. And so Chicago played a huge role in that. And the water company he co-founded was called the Chicala Water Company, CHI for Chicago, CA for California, LA for Los Angeles, to represent the 3 points of connection to the company. He did that. And now, here, let's talk about some other people. The man on the right lived in Kenwood on Oakenwald Street or Avenue.
Really?
Yeah, Myron, that's my cousin. Myron Hutchinson Richardson was an inventor of vending machines. He invented many types and patented many types of vending machines. He invented a new type of windmill. And he lived right up the street here in Kenwood, and he founded the Richardson Brokerage Company, a local real estate brokerage. He then later moved to Albany Park, up on the northwest side, and his daughter, Judith Cornell Richardson, was a female industrial CEO during the 1930s and 40s, and you never hear about her either. She helped invent blacklight technology. So
Okay.
Judith Cornell Richardson, his daughter, who was born in 1913, she was inspired by her father's vending machine inventions and windmill inventions. And she got into science herself, and she was a trained dancer here during the Jazz Age. She had an advertising, she had an advertising agency with 17 people working for her in the 1930s in Chicago. She was based in the Loop, her headquarters in the Loop. Then she founded Chicago Blacklight Productions Company, which manufactured blacklight bulbs, blacklight ink, blacklight pigments, and all kinds of blacklight electricity materials. She helped develop the blacklight technology that enabled the discovery and detection of fraudulent documents during World War II and the Cold War, and spoilage in food before natural visible light would reveal those flaws. So she helped with the war effort. Here in the Loop, her company was one of the leading companies for anti-espionage technology. Again, no one's really heard of her either. And I didn't learn about her until very recently as I was doing all this, because again, so much of the family history kind of faded out. This book is meant to bring as much of it as possible back together. Myron Hutchinson Richardson of Kenwood, and later Albany Park. On the left, Ada Willard Richardson is the daughter, one of the daughters of William Douglas Richardson. She is my great-great-grandmother. She has a tremendous number of descendants in Chicago today, all over the city. I'm just one. We're not all even really in touch with each other, but it's a huge, huge family. Bunn, Richardson, Stryker, Willard, they're all here. We need to have a reunion, but Janice said if we do it, we'd have to rent out the United Center. Because 33 plus branches of descendants, you know? Anyway, at one time, she and her sister, you could say, were, not to over-dramatize it, but for a brief time before the coup, she and her sister were heiresses to 6 million acres of South America. And then she and her sister were heiresses to Richardson Construction Company, Richardson Investment Company, the Chicago Water Company, the Russian-American Direct Transportation Company, Springfield Iron Company, and a number of other railroads and manufacturers here in Chicago and Springfield. She, her son, my great-grandfather, Willard Bunn, co-founded Steak and Shake and Heath Bar.
No.
Yes, they're both Illinois companies. That's my great-grandpa, Willard Bunn. He was one of the founders of Heath Bar and Steak and Shake. Okay, at the World's Fair, again, we're back to Hyde Park. The Brownell Car Company of St. Louis, which was co-founded by Milo Barnum Richardson of the Richardson family. They were the largest, well, St. Louis was the world's largest manufacturer of streetcars. It had many great records in terms of being a superb. St. Louis is one of the largest industrial cities ever in history. Brownell Car Company was one of the major manufacturers of Chicago's streetcars. They would have provided a lot of supply to the transportation for the World's Fair. And also they were making cars for the early developing private railroad systems in the city. Charles Richardson on the left, a lawyer here in Chicago. He died in the Spanish-American War in his 20s. Never had children, never married. He's another relative, another cousin. And on the right, has anyone here heard of the Harwood baseball? That's the standard figure-8 stitch design. That was invented by Harrison Harwood of Natick, Massachusetts, whose daughter married a Richardson. And their son, Richardson Harwood, ran the company. That became the standard baseball for all the leagues.
You're connected with Spalding?
No, that's a competitor. Albert Goodwill Spalding, who was here, I believe, was a competitor. But they were very much equal in many ways. But Harwood baseball was the one that did the standard design originally and provided the ball to most of the clubs at the time.
Andrew, Gary, can you back me up? Ernie Harwood, he was a longtime announcer for the Detroit Tigers, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Harwood.
Oh, that's another Harwood, yeah, that's probably not related, but that's interesting, it's the same name though. Yeah.
That's an unusual
Yeah.
name too.
Colonel Charlie Richardson, who died 1968, born 1889, he lived in Rogers Park and then later Glenview. He was the co-founder of the United States Civil Air Patrol, which is the civilian auxiliary to the U.S. Air Force. And he was an executive in a Chicago heating company back in the 30s and 40s and 50s. What he did, he founded the Chicago headquarters of the Civil Air Patrol and revamped the entire security, surveillance, and rescue system and flight plan for all the Chicago metropolitan region during the 40s and 50s.
And was he involved or at flight school with young Landis?
I don't know.
Before going over to the British
I never
Air Force?
found his academic records. He attended the University of Illinois, I believe. That's all.
As did young Landis.
Okay. They could have known each other.
they classmates, and yeah, Landis became the #2 ace, American ace in World War I.
That name's familiar. What's his first name?
Gresham?
Gresham
Landis.
Okay.
John Kennesaw Mountain Landis' son.
Oh, we know Kennesaw Mountain Landis. Kennesaw Mountain Landis was a business partner of my great-great-uncle Frank Jones. And they worked together in the baseball. He also worked with Henry Henson Brigham during the Black Sox scandal, who was my grandfather's relative.
Back when Landis was still a federal judge,
Yes.
who deflowered standard oil.
And he's also Northwestern now, right now. Charlie Richardson also was an early supporter of the new O'Hare Airport. He was there when it opened. And basically, he helped support modern aviation in Chicago. He's one of the fathers of Chicago as an aviation center. Okay, back to the World's Fair, back to Hyde Park again. William Henry Bertner is from my father's family. Bertner is one of my paternal lineages from Pittsburgh. My father's family have 8 generations in Pittsburgh. They came in the 1700s and they're among the founders of Pittsburgh and Allegheny County and Butler County. The family home is now a museum with federal status. And the Bertners, one branch went to Cincinnati and got into railroad manufacturing there, and they had a big branch here. William Henry Bertner, Charles Davis, Thomas Egan, and William Lodge of Cincinnati and Chicago started the Davis and Egan Company, which was the largest railroad engine and machine maker in Chicago. They were located over by the Barnum and Richardson Company, west of Union Station, right up west of the South Branch of the river, over off Clinton Street in Jefferson area. And they had a huge fair, World's Fair exhibit. They brought in 25 train cars from Cincinnati, filled with machinery, to exhibit in the either the machinery hall or the manufacturer's.
Transportation, probably.
Yes.
Or transportation as well?
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
okay.
exactly. And so they brought that up here, but Bertner co-founded and was vice president and board member of the largest machine manufacturing company in Chicago at the time. That's my father's mother's family. Frank Hatch Jones was postmaster of Chicago and a major developer of Hyde Park, Woodlawn, South Shore, Hegewisch, East Side, Calumet Heights, Avondale, Chatham railroads. He was my great-great-uncle and a good friend of Kennesaw Mountain Landis. Now, Frank Jones was born in 1856 in Pike County, Illinois, outside of Quincy, a little place called Briggsville. He went to Northwestern, he went to Yale, then Northwestern Law School, came to Chicago, became very active as a Democrat here, which has put him at odds with the fact that he married Jacob Bond's daughter, who's the head of the Republican Party in the state. So that was an interesting political twist.
Was he at Northwestern Law? He might also have been a classmate of Landis.
Jones was born in 1856. Landis is somewhere in the 1850s. Isn't he?
Right, okay.
Yeah.
No, it couldn't be that.
I couldn't remember when Landis was born. When was he born?
Yeah.
60s?
Kennesaw Mountain?
He was baseball.
No,
That's right.
his father was a sergeant, and the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain. That's
right. Yeah.
That's very soon after that. Kennesaw Mountain was born in southern Indiana.
I think I remember there being a connection to the war.
Yeah, that was it.
Yeah, Kennesaw Mountain Landis is from Ohio.
Right.
Yeah, but Frank Jones.
Yeah, but they had migrated to Indiana.
Okay. Frank Jones was vice president of the Calumet Electric Street Railway System, which was the first, if I'm not mistaken, the first electric street railway system in the south side of Chicago. And it connected Indiana all through what I like to call the Calumet Corridor, and I refer to that name all throughout the book. All the way went from basically East Chicago, Hammond area, through what was Hegewisch, Roseland, and it came up. Its northernmost point was Stony Island and 63rd. So Stony Island ran along one of the northernmost routes of the Calumet. And Frank Jones was vice president. John Farson of Oak Park, who built the Pleasant Home Mansion, designed by George Washington. It was the president, so they were good friends. And then Kennesaw Mountain Landis was a friend of Frank Jones. They all belonged to the same civic organizations. Now, Frank Jones served as postmaster of Chicago. He was assistant postmaster general of the United States. He had a law firm at the Monadnock building downtown in the Loop. He also co-founded the first state pawners society here in Chicago, which was a loan organization that was attempting to overturn the corrupt loan shark practices in the city. He worked with Stanley Field and John G. Shedd and many other well-known industrialists here and merchants. In doing that, Frank Jones was on the board of the Chicago Opera back then, and this is before the current Chicago Opera, and was very active also as a banker, and he was a junior co-founding executive of Continental Illinois National Bank in 1910.
Okay.
He married my great-great-aunt Sarah Irwin Bunn. She died. He remarried Nellie Grant, Sartoris, the daughter of President Ulysses S. Grant.
Yes.
And then they lived in Gold Coast. The building is still there. It's on the National Register. Anyway, he was a major developer of Hyde Park Township railways, local electric street railway in Hyde Park Township. The Calumet Electric Street Railway and Frank Jones are intricately connected, along with John Farson. And that would have served the World's Fair as well, because the company, I think, was chartered in 1891. Okay, we're moving up more recent. We're almost done here. How many people here are familiar with the very large housing development at 83rd and Cottage Grove called Chatham Park? Charlie knows it, Janice knows it, Cleveland knows it, Fran knows it, Ruth knows it. It was the largest housing development in the entire city of Chicago. I don't know where it stands now, but for a long time, or quite a while at least, in 1938 when it was built, it was the largest in the city. The man on the left, I'm sorry the picture is a little fuzzy, I couldn't make it clear on this. The picture's in the book. That's Robert Giles Reagan. That is my great-grand uncle on my mother's side. He is part of our Irish family here. We had a lot of Chicago Irish family that came during the potato famine to Wisconsin. Some stayed in Wisconsin, others came to Chicago. He was the founder of Reagan Construction Company and then Reagan Contracting Company. He had two construction companies headquartered at the Builders Building on Wacker Drive on the south, right south, almost not quite across the merchandise market, almost, catty corner. He was the building contractor for all of Chatham Park, and he also co-owned the development company with George Dovenmule, the Chatham Park Incorporated Company. So he helped develop Chatham Park and he built the whole thing. It involved over 5 million bricks, over 1,200 tons of steel, and over 1 million square feet of lumber. Not square feet, board feet, yeah.
What year was that?
1938.
Was that part of the Works Progress Administration?
No, not that I know. No, it was all private. It was all privately owned. And he was one of the owners.
I see.
Totally private companies. And not only that, Mayor Edward Joseph Kelly was the mayor of Chicago at that time, so we have an Irish brotherhood here. and I must, in the interest of full disclosure, mention that old Uncle Bob Reagan got himself into a couple accusations of kickbacks and graft and other things like that.
Surprise, surprise.
I can't imagine Irish building contractors in Chicago ever having that happen. But anyway, Robert Giles Reagan, of course, he died in 1948 as a young man, 10 years after that project was complete. He built the first Motorola factory. He was good friends with Paul Galvin, also an Irish Catholic American here in Chicago. He built the Coca-Cola factory on Plainfield Road. He built the Tractor Motive Corporation. He built a lot of stuff all over the city. He specialized in industrial construction and very, very large scale. And in the book, Chapter 7, which I call Chicago Irish and Old Brickwork, deals with our whole Irish family. It was an immense family. Reagan, Hogan, McKay, Hanrahan, Sheehy, Trudell, all those were here in the city in various areas. But he did a lot for Hyde Park Township, because Hyde Park Township was the place where Chicago had its largest housing company and housing development. Chatham Park Incorporated. Reagan co-founded the company, and he did all the building. So that's, again, a major piece of Hyde Park Township that is still there today. Janice gave me a tour of it, and she showed my mother and stepfather when we came up. And so he was not only a major developer of Chatham, but of the Hyde Park Township region of Chicago as well. There's a picture. This is a stock photo off the internet. This is Chatham Park. That's one of the buildings. They all look the same, and they're nice brick constructions. And I even found an index listing all the prices for the rentals when he built it, and I put that in the book.
So that's for middle class people?
Yes,
basically?
exactly. Exactly. A lot of them would have been Irish Americans.
Right.
But, I mean, probably given the time, given who was involved with it, you know.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, we're in the last part of the presentation now. This is, Ron brought up Sangamo Electric Company earlier. The man on the left is another ancestor of mine, Jacob Bunn Jr. He's a great uncle. He was here in Chicago, lived here, worked for the shoe company. He was vice president of Self Schwab Shoe Company, then went back to Springfield and met the young man on the right, who was much younger, R.C. Lanphier, Robert Carter Lanphier, after whom this famous Springfield High School is named, he was an engineering graduate of Yale University. And when he came back to Springfield after he graduated Yale, he met Jacob Bunn Jr. at a party. And Jacob said, I have a German inventor here with me named Ludwig Gutmann. He's come to America with a patent for a very interesting machine designed to measure electricity coming in and out of buildings, called a meter. Ludwig Gutmann met R.C. Lanphier when Jacob Bunn Jr. brought them together and said, young man Lanphier here, let's see if Yale University taught you anything. I'm going to pay 2 months at the University of Illinois for you to do trials with Mr. Gutmann to see if this thing will work. And if it does, I'm going to finance you and we're going to start a corporation. 2 months later, young Lanphier came back and said, sir, I believe it's going to work. That became the modern electric meter that you see on every building in the world today. People did this at the same time Tesla had his patents, and they were competitors with Tesla. They were just as early as Tesla and Edison. They knew Edison and worked with him. They formed the Sangamo Electric Company in January of 1899. It originally was the metering division of the Illinois Watch Company, which was Chicago and Springfield. Sangamo Electric quickly developed a Chicago presence and had its local headquarters at the old Colony building in the Loop. And it provided approximately, we think, 1/4 to 1/3 of the electric meters of the planet by 1950. It worked. They made almost all the sonar ever made in the Western Hemisphere for all the nuclear submarines. They created the machinery that was used to detect the German U-boats that enabled the sinking of German U-boats. They designed electrical systems for farms and ranches. They developed flashing road technology for warning signs. They invented meters, gas meters, 3-coin payment meters, all of those. Any kind of meter you can imagine, Sangamo Electric Company made. Lanphier, Gutmann, and other engineers were the engineering people behind it. Lanphier co-founded it with Jacob Bunn Jr., Henry Bunn, John Whitfield Bunn, and other members of the family. And the company failed in 1975. It couldn't compete with General Electric and Westinghouse at the same time, so the family sold it off to Schlumberger at a huge loss, unfortunately, but or what it should have been. By 1939, Sangamo Electric had a presence in every country on Earth. It had a product distribution presence in every country in the world that existed in 1939, and they were traded on the Chicago Stock Exchange, New York Stock Exchange, London Stock Exchange, Toronto Stock Exchange, Montreal Curb Market, and Canadian Stock Exchange. And the Bunns and the Lanphiers were the controlling owners of it. The company made almost every kind of electric device you can think of, radio tubes, everything, stuff that is way beyond me in terms of technology, but I give the list of some of their major inventions in the back of the book, in Chapter 8, and that became a major Chicago company, and its product was all over Hyde Park, of course, just like everything else here. Sangamo, that's their logo on the right. It is meant to look like a melting word that's been hit by lightning. That was the idea. And again, they were the world's largest electric meter maker, period. They could beat GE and Westinghouse in meter making, but they couldn't beat them in everything else. So they could never compete on that scale, but they could beat them in meters. There's the old Colony building on the left, and other family companies were in there as well.
Where was that building?
That's Van Buren and Plymouth.
407 South Dearborn.
Okay, I know,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
I've been in that building and they've remodeled it, but I was there when it was still very old in the 1970s.
And I'm jealous, Kathy, because I wish I could have seen it back then.
It's very good on Plymouth Court.
Yeah, Plymouth Court. I got a tour of it about 3 years ago with the Architecture Foundation, a behind-the-scenes tour. They did a private tour for all the members.
Right.
And that was really nice.
It is on, yeah, I was going to say they've improved it.
This is the World's Fair of 1933. Now, Chicago, Sangamo Electric Company participated in that. They had a huge electrical exhibit. And after the 1933 fair was over, they donated their entire electrical exhibit to Julius Rosenwald to start a part of the Museum of Science and Industry. So John Whitfield Bunn, actually he had passed away in 1920, Jacob Bunn Jr., who would die in 1926, Henry Bunn, who I think was still alive, yeah, he died a little later. The Bunn family donated the entire Sangamo Electric World's Fair exhibit. This is the 1933 Century of Progress Exposition, celebrating 100 years of Chicago village and city status, 1933. They were good friends with Rosenwald. Samuel Rosenwald, father of Julius, was in business with Jacob Bunn in Springfield. They co-founded the Springfield Board of Trade. The Rosenwalds worked with the Bunns extensively, so Julius Rosenwald was in touch with the family here as well. The Bunns gave that whole exhibit to Rosenwald, and it became one of the kernels and foundations of the whole Museum of Science and Industry section. So the family did work with that. William Douglas Richardson at the 1893 World's Fair was a founding member of the Field Museum, which started here as the Columbia Museum in the Palace of Fine Arts building. Now, one other thing here, Pullman. Sangamo Electric Company contracted with the Pullman Company, also located in Hyde Park Township, in Pullman community, to provide the electric meters and devices for every Pullman car that existed, pretty much. So Pullman bought about 15,000, I think, or no, sorry, 6,000 Pullman cars were equipped with Sangamo Electric meter devices. So Sangamo Electric had a huge presence as a product distributor in Hyde Park Township. Okay, the man on the left is my mother's uncle, my granduncle, Robert Cunningham Taylor Jr. He lived at 5124 South Harper, around the corner.
Nice.
Yep, he lived here in 1930, 31. He was a banker. He had gone to Knox College. He was from Cass County originally, but his grandfather had been from Chicago. And his mother's family, the Strikers, were some of the earliest settlers. And his mother's family included the Kinseys and the Wolcotts and the Posts and the Henshaws. So his mother's family were among the founding families of Chicago. When he lived here at 5124 South Harper, and Janice, thank you for taking me to that building last year, earlier this year. We went to see it. It's still standing. He was a banker. We don't know where he worked. We never could find the bank. But my guess is, since the Hyde Park Kenwood National Bank was started at the same time he moved to that block, I think he might have worked at the Hyde Park Kenwood National Bank. And I can't prove it, but I think it's a good theory. There he is on the right. He's the man in the center. That's the 1930s. He went to Harvard Business School class in 1932, came back to Chicago and moved to Beverly. Lived at 105th and South Campbell, rented an apartment. He never married. He was killed in World War II in Operation Market Garden and is buried in Margroton Cemetery in Holland. Mom has seen the cemetery there with all the soldiers. See, he never got to come back here and do what he wanted to do, but he did do quite a bit here, and at one time he owned a large land and investment company. By 1944 was a major shareholder of the United States Steel Corporation and had a huge land company in Illinois. We think he moved to Beverly because his cousin, his cousin Oswald McNeil, also a tailor, had moved to Blue Island. And he had been a founder of the National Sunday School Publishing Company here and many other companies in Chicago and had a law firm downtown. We think maybe he talked his cousin into coming down near Blue Island to Beverly. This is my grandfather, Henry Stryker Taylor. He's, of course, all these people are deceased now. Grandpa died in 1994. I knew him for 13 years, so I really never got to know him well, but I've heard many stories. Grandpa went to Knox College and then got into the railroad and banking business. He was president of the McClure Stryker Taylor Land Company of Illinois and Michigan, which he was a major landlord of Kmart back in Lansing, and Kresge's back then. And then here in Chicago, he didn't live here, his brother did, but he lived here all the time on business. He did a lot of business with Northern Trust Company. And he, at one time, by the 1960s, Grandpa was the controlling shareholder of the Pennsylvania Railroad, which was the fourth largest corporation in the world approximately by 1960. He and Howard Butcher of Philadelphia were the top two individual, non-institutional owners. So they were the top people at the Pennsylvania, which was doing about $2 to $3 billion a year in the 1940s. And had the largest railroad network in the world. He also co-founded the Penn Central Transportation Company in 1963, which was a $6 billion corporation then. And that was the world's largest transportation system. It would go bankrupt a few years later, and he went down with it with over 100,000 other shareholders. Everyone lost all that they had in that company. No one foresaw that coming. They thought the railroads could never fail. The company he and Howard Butcher were the top controlling owners of in terms of individual ownership had a tremendous presence in Hyde Park. It owned a lot of the railroads that came in and out of the Calumet Corridor. It acquired the Wabash Railroad, what was left of it, the Pittsburgh, Fort Wayne, and Chicago Railroad Company, many others that came in and out. They owned the Englewood Railway out there, which I know is not Hyde Park Township, but the south side. And then they had they had some local lines that went in and out of Indiana, into Hegewisch, and things like that. So the companies he worked with were very much involved in the whole city. Chicago was one of the other headquarters of the Pennsylvania. Philadelphia was the main. Chicago and New York were the others. So they basically had 3 headquarters. When he and Howard Butcher were the controlling individual owners, Pennsylvania Railroad owned 50% of Chicago Union Station. Another cousin of ours, who grew up in Washington Park, Genevieve Cogan, who had gone to the University of Chicago in the 1950s, she won a naming contest for the gift store at Union Station that was in the middle of the main lobby. And it was called the Isle of Gifts. She's the one who named that, and she later moved out to Lombard. So one of his cousins was the one who did that, so when this company was involved there. Okay, the people on the left, that's the Ferguson and Lee family. They are from Pullman, and later lived right here down the street at 5637 South Dorchester. That is 5637 South Dorchester. The man on the left is William Lee. He's a relative by marriage. The woman in the middle is my cousin Florence Ferguson, his wife, and then the woman on the right is her sister Clara Ferguson. The Ferguson family came to Pullman very early, in the 1800s, and William Lee worked with George Pullman. George Pullman hired Lee to be one of his 2 chief surveyors for the whole Pullman community. So the Ferguson side of our family surveyed Pullman for George Pullman. George Pullman was a business partner of John Bunn and Jacob Bunn. And when they got married, when William Lee married Florence Ferguson in November of 1888, they were married by Reverend E.C. Ogle of the Greenstone Church in Pullman. And then they took a honeymoon and then came back and moved into the Florence Hotel in Pullman. It is not named after my cousin Florence Ferguson, it is named after Florence Pullman, the daughter of George Pullman. But interestingly, they lived there. After that, he was hired as the chief engineer of Hyde Park. The man on the left was the chief engineer of Hyde Park. Then they moved from Pullman up to 5637 Dorchester. The baby in the picture is my cousin Morton Lee Pierce. He graduated University of Chicago. He's deceased now. Lauren Ralph Dodson, my grandfather's first cousin, co-founded Continental Can Company. Is anyone here familiar with that name? No. Continental Can with Carl Cotter Conway of Oak Park. He was the big boss.
My husband was brought here to help fix remember the cans that didn't work? The soda cans?
The ones that
That's what brought me to Chicago.
Is that right? Oh, well, that's fascinating. I want to hear more about that. This is another great story of entrepreneurship here and leadership. Carl Cotter Conway from Oak Park was the major founder of Continental Can. He was born in about 1873 and went to Yale. And he met Lauren Dodson, who was born in 1897 in Columbus, Ohio. He took him in and said, I want to give this young man a chance to work with me building up this huge container company. In 1925, he got Lauren Ralph Dodson along with, I think, Sherlock McEwen and Hans Eggers and a few other people to reorganize the whole Continental Can Company in 1924-25. Lauren Ralph Dodson got to be one of the co-founding executives under the leadership of Carl Conway of Continental Can. They later would become one of the largest corporations in the world, the largest container company in the world, and one of Chicago's largest companies. They had 2 factories at the Union Stockyards, and they had 24 subsidiaries that I've counted in Chicago alone. White Cap Company, Cameron Can Machinery Company, McDonald Machine Company, Union Factory Stockyards 1 and 2. They had the research laboratory over at 7600 South Racine, which employed over 100 scientists. And the company was generating sales of over $1 billion a year by 1955. And Lauren Dodson became secretary-treasurer of the entire company, managing the whole thing and all of its subsidiaries. The company had over 1 million acres of pine trees to make cardboard boxes, corrugated shipping.
Amazing.
They made water bottles, they made cans of every sort, vacuum seal technology, plumbing pipes, valves, sealing technology, everything, aircraft parts, I think, car parts, everything. It wasn't just cans. The Continental Can Company, CCC, the 3 C's, the red and white, that was it. And Chicago, Pittsburgh, and New York City were their 3 headquarters. Their Chicago location was at the Field Building on South LaSalle. So Lauren Ralph Dodson held executive leadership in many of the subsidiaries, as well as the top company. I mean, he was basically, if you want, some people consider the treasurer to be the #2 executive, depending on how you look at it. He was treasurer and secretary of the whole parent corporation, in addition to being of the top of many, near the top of many of the other subsidiaries here in the city. So he helped build that, and his daughter lived in Chicago, and his son-in-law was from here. So that's Dad's family there. Robert Grogan Call on the left was my dad's uncle, my granduncle. He co-founded the American Gas and Electric Service Corporation of New York City and Ohio and West Virginia, now known as AEP. It's the Service Corporation of American Electric Power. He was the first chemist in the history of American Electric Power. He invented the chemical technologies that are used to clean the giant station turbines while they're spinning at top speed. That's the Call method, the first time it was ever done in world history. It's still used today everywhere in the world. He was born in 1897. These 2 men are first cousins. They're both born the same day in December 21st, 1897 in Ohio, and they both did huge things here in Chicago and in Ohio and New York. Uncle Bob Call, Dad remembered him really well. He helped develop Again, he co-founded the American Gas and Electric Service Corporation, which co-founded the entire nuclear power system of Chicago. Willis Gale of ComEd worked with Philip Sporn of American Electric Power to develop the nuclear power system and to build the huge pylon system. I think it's almost 500 pylons that run from Orland Park to St. Joseph County, Indiana, the Calumet Corridor. Uncle Bob Call was the chief chemist, senior engineer, and co-founding executive of that company at that time. So he helped develop much of the south industrial region of Chicago and the Calumet Corridor. And he died in 1974. Lauren Ralph Dodson died in 1972. And Dad lived here in Chicago for a while, hoping maybe he'll move back someday. But so the Call family from Ohio, they have 8 generations in Ohio, but they did do a lot in Chicago. And again, this is just a small sample of the over 1,000 people roughly that are in the book. These are some of the most important stories, and many of the ones that connect to Hyde Park, but there is no way I could fit all this into one presentation. So I hope you will consider buying a copy and learning about the lost and forgotten histories. Almost every person I've talked to you about today has been forgotten about, lost, or thrown away in history. I wanted to bring these people back. I've had to refer to a lot of them as family members because I want you to know how I connected them in the family tree. That's not the important thing. The important thing is this is your history too. And I want to read you something really quickly here. That's the last slide. So I'll leave it on there. And I'm going to read just a couple lines here as we close. I'll read you a section of my epilogue here. And please let me know if you can't hear. Carl Sandburg, the ingenious Illinois poet, wrote a poem called Chicago. In it, he praised many singular achievements of the city and called the city, quote, City of the Big Shoulders. The qualities and achievements of the city that he specifically glorified are the very same ones that are praised, honored, and chronicled in the present book. Sandburg, in his poem, honored and described the city of Chicago as, quote, hog butcher, tool maker, stacker of wheat, player with railroads, and freight handler to the nation, end quote. My intention for the present book is that it will provide a familial, industrial, and civic history of the city of Big Shoulders, a city whose shoulders have singularly and selflessly given incomprehensible power and force for the building up of the United States of America and the world. Let us always retain, therefore, a stewardful and protective proudness that we are, quote, hog butcher, tool maker, stacker of wheat, player with railroads, and freight handler to the nation. It is imperative that everyone claims his or her own personal, unique, sincere, and relentless stewardship over the people, histories, experiences, achievements, and heritages that are contained in this book and in others like it. Because these histories and heritages belong to everyone and to everyone uniquely. There's nothing here that's mine, this is everybody's. I have my own unique connection to it, but so do you. It belongs as much to every one of you as it ever did or could to me. So there's no possession here other than a communal possession. And if more people could take this sense of stewardship in these histories, we wouldn't forget our histories anymore. And Chicago is under fire nationally and internationally. We are often talked about as a joke or as a city that only has criminals. That's not true. I still think we're the greatest city in the world. Despite our problems, every city has problems. If we could become more active stewards of the histories here that have been lost, then we could remind the world of who we really are as a city and who we are as a region in the Midwest. So I'll conclude here. Let us invite the United States and the world, therefore, to know now as they have never known before the singular greatness of Chicago, the city of the wild onions, and its people, both past and present. And I talk about the significance of onions. The name Chicago means place of the wild onions. And the same wild onion grass that grows here, and did grow here during the early settlement period, grew along the mountains of my home in Virginia. So I came from one place of the wild onions to another, and it's right for me that I call both places home. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Sorry, I have to.
Thank you for great questions, too.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to call you earlier and ask you.
Well, let's do this.